Hi everyone, my name is Harshdeep. I'm an undergraduate student as well as the director of CLAIR Voices. So CLAIR Voices, as well as the purpose of this interview, is to educate ourselves as well as our audience about the refugee and immigrant issues people are facing through multiple perspectives by hearing the detailed studies of people like you, Will, and to express our appreciation towards the work that you do for these issues as well as trauma care. Eunice and Yin, can you introduce yourselves as well?
Hi, my name is Eunice Choi. I am a member of the CLAIR Voices team. I am from Fresno, California, and I will be one of the interviewers today in this session.
Hi, my name is Yeon Kim. I'm from Seoul, South Korea, and am currently a junior in Penn Foster High School. And in terms of Project CLAIR, I'm a co-founder as well as the director of education department right now. And you probably know about this from your brother Harrison, one of our great tutors. But just to briefly explain about Project CLAIR, it's a government registered nonprofit that provides free English tutoring online to refugees and immigrants by matching tutors who speak the same native languages as the students. Yeah, so Harshdeep, could you go on?
And Will, would you like to introduce yourself as well as what you do?
Sure. So my name is Will. I work at the Office for Violence Prevention and Victim Assistance at Rutgers University. So our office works really around the issues of trauma and violence, and we work often with students and faculty and staff that have experienced really any form of violence or trauma. Specifically, we go into a lot of issues around sexual violence, domestic violence, stalking, but we also go into issues of trauma and violence as a whole. And we know these issues affect many populations in incredibly different ways. Rutgers University is also in the state of New Jersey, and I'm also a student myself. I'm in grad school right now.
Yes, you can ask your first question.
Okay, I will start the interview. What kind of specific topics do you include when discussing immigrant and refugee pieces in your classes? How do you do so?
I probably should have said in the beginning too. Beyond like working in VPVA, like in that office, I also teach around issues of trauma and violence as well. So one thing that's incredibly important when doing this work is talking about how these issues are affecting different populations. One thing we know at universities, not just in New Jersey and the US, but around the world, is universities have students that are refugees, universities have students that are immigrants, universities have students that are also undocumented. And it's really important that staff, faculty, professors, that they're aware that these students are on campus. And what we know often about refugee experiences is a lot of times people experience trauma across the process of coming to different countries. I mean, the essence of being a refugee is often seeking safety, sometimes seeking asylum, and often experiencing trauma. So the pieces that we kind of include, at least in my class, and what we try to educate on is really getting across the point of these experiences. We try to, bring up different stories. We try to really go into what are the barriers. That's a really important topic. There's a lot of barriers that a lot of refugee and immigrant communities face, especially with accessing mental health or accessing support if they experience violence. So one thing we try to do is let students know one, that we exist, that they're able to access our services. And we try to educate in that way.
Wow, that's really inspiring.
Yeah, I think it's really important that we also include refugees and immigrants in our everyday lives, even on the college campus. So yeah, and also to move on to the second question regarding your studies. So I read in your studies that you focus around the concepts of violence and engaging more men in terms of violence prevention. And I was wondering of the recent social media sort of like viral post that goes on that relates with your studies, which is crossing out protect your daughters and instead putting educate your son. So what are some specific ways that education can provide men in terms of violence prevention?
Yeah, I mean, men's engagement and masculinity, those are the two main things I do at VPBA. And that work is incredibly important too. When we know about, violence prevention efforts, gender equality, all these efforts, is a lot of the people not showing up to the work are men. There's a lot of reasons for that. One of the reasons is a lot of men often view these issues as women's issues. But the thing is, violence and trauma affect everybody. And often men are the ones that are enabling that violence or doing that violence. 98% of the time, men are the ones, engaging in sexual violence or domestic violence. So that's one reason why it's important to engage men, that they're the root of the problem. But there's also plenty of other reasons to engage men. These men are survivors, right? 1 in 6 men are a survivor of sexual violence before the age of 18. Men are at higher risk of committing suicide. They commit suicide about 3 times more likely. Men are more likely to resort to more violent means of coping. Men often use alcohol as a way of coping. So we also know that men are not addressing their own mental health, and they're not knowing how to cope when they also might have experienced violence. So, men need to be part of the conversations because these issues also affect men in different ways. And we also know that it affects men across different communities, different cultures, different religions, just different identities in general, in different ways as well. I think I went on a tangent. I don't even remember the first part of the question.
Yeah, you answered it right. So I think it's really important to engage in new yet obvious perspective in domestic violence of men as both victims as well as aggressors. And moving on to the third question, it's sort of like simple yet fundamentally important question to your studies. So what is trauma-informed care in your definition?
Yeah. So I think the first thing in order to define trauma-informed care is kind of to define, what trauma is. So trauma is a response that comes out of either a physical experience or an emotional experience. It's an experience that has to be distressing or disturbing in any way to the person. And in that process, it affects that individual's kind of ability to cope or to navigate. And often it's going to bring on a lot of symptoms. One thing we hear a lot is trauma lives in the body, and that's incredibly true. Trauma will showcase itself in so many different ways. So for some people, it might showcase in PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder type symptoms, right? So some of those can be like flashbacks, hypervigilance, anxiety, panic attacks, memory loss, fragmented memory. There could be a ton of triggers that might pop up for a survivor. A lot of times for survivors, big triggers can include things like scent, seeing things, seeing people. And then there's a lot of emotions that come up. Trauma emotions can be things around feeling depressed, sadness, frustration, anger, fear. So knowing that, then we can kind of go into trauma-informed care, which is basically the assumption and the approach in any field, any discipline, anybody can do this, that assumes any individual is more likely than not to have experienced some form of trauma within their life. And that makes sense, right? We know that many children growing up have experienced adverse childhood experiences. We know that 1 in 2 or 1 in 3 women have experienced sexual violence before the age of 18. We know, many people across refugee communities have experienced trauma, both where they might be coming from, but also a lot of times within where they end up. I mean, an example of that, you might ask a question that I can go into this example deeper too, is child separation at the US border. A lot of those children face trauma before coming, and then that policy also induced more trauma on that child. So there's also different forms of trauma. That's one of them. That's called system-induced trauma. There's trauma that can come from wars. There's trauma that can come from gun violence. There's trauma that can come from, again, anything that's really adverse or distressing. So trauma-informed care is kind of somewhat new. It's not new in the sense that like trauma has been studied for a while, but now we're starting to see, especially more universities and more industries finally like start doing a little bit more training around trauma and the fact that, you know, people should act in ways in their roles that are more supportive to survivors. Because the goal of trauma-informed care is to prevent like re-traumatization. Like we don't want to re-traumatize survivors, and we want to try to decrease as many barriers that exist right now.
So you talked about PTSD and many forms of physical and mental violence, especially for refugees and immigrants who experience trauma beforehand and also afterhand in society, including college campuses. And I think it's really paramount in terms of trauma-informed care that they not only include the people who experience the trauma, but also the people who are surrounded, like surrounding people and people who don't even have trauma, in terms of bringing them in the story and being supportive. And also talking about refugees, they leave home due to a lot of reasons, such as like political turmoil, war, and violence. And according to our last interview with Dr. Carranza at McMaster University, there's been a recent increase in the number of women, refugee women who moved to Canada because of intimate partner violence. And so when you work with survivors of domestic violence as well as sexual violence, what sort of trauma do they have and what is the best way to relieve them of the trauma as much as possible?
Yeah. So my office, a lot of the people that we see have experienced things like sexual violence, sexual assault, sexual harassment, domestic violence, and also stalking. So those are kind of the big three that we see. Stalking is something also that is not talked about as much and also impacts people greatly. The average length that stalking can occur for is about 2 years. And when we're talking about, you know, university students, oftentimes they're there for about 4 years, depending on the program. 2 years is half of their time. That's a lot. Again, we see people that experience all forms of violence. We also see sometimes people that experience like being robbed, like robbery, sometimes gun violence. But, you know, across the board, when we're talking about anybody that has experienced any form of violence, especially when it's woman or someone of color that has experienced that violence, the system and the people respond in the worst of ways. A lot of times people aren't believing survivors. A lot of times survivors don't have trust in judicial processes, and it's all fair why they wouldn't have trust, because a lot of times the processes aren't supportive. So one thing we can do individually is to try to ease some of those barriers. The way we do it, first step is, you know, this first step is believing survivors. You know, that's a phrase that we often hear kind of thrown around, but the reason it's important and the reason to do it in action is because a lot of times when survivors are sharing their story, talking about their story for the first time, they're going to peers first. They're going to people that are around your age. We did a assessment at Rutgers. We know that our student body, 76% of the time, a student who has experienced violence is going to another student to talk about that violence first. So if students are going to students and for the first time they're sharing their story to their peer, if that peer starts going into the mode of not believing and start, you know, questioning their existence, questioning why they did that, or even just flat out saying, I don't believe you, that survivor might not ever get the support they need, and they might not ever share their story again. And survivors aren't asking people in the moment to be a lawyer. They're not asking people to be a judge. They're not asking people to be a police officer. They're just asking for support. Not every survivor wants to go through reporting processes. And especially in the beginning, a lot of survivors are just looking for support. So by offering your belief in them, that's the first step. The next step is actively listening to them when they are sharing their story. These stories are hard to share. And a lot of times the stories are going to be messy. Like I just said in the beginning, memory is something that is often impacted in the time violence is happening. It's going to make sense for survivors for their story to be all over the place. It's going to make sense for a survivor to have trouble sharing their story because it's going to bring on a lot of emotions. So active listening means being patient with them. It means validating what they're saying and feeling. It means, clarifying anything that you might not understand. And it also means not forcing the survivor to do anything. Another thing too is one thing we can do to support the survivors to empower them. And one way we can empower them is not force them to do anything that they're not ready to do. So one way we can empower them is to be there, sit there, actively listen, and then and to also know the resources. What we can do individually too is look up the resources in our local community. It's different around the world, but there is resources. That's just a little bit. I can keep going.
I mean, thank you so much for bringing like the specific ways that we can deal with it, especially because personally, when one of my friends shared about her traumatic experience of being victims of sexual violence, I honestly did not know exactly how to react. And I just wish that I could have given more support than I did before. So thank you so much for bringing like how exactly we can support and empower the victims who are especially our peers, usually our peers.
And thank you for sharing that experience. And that's something too. We're not going to be perfect 100% of the time, but what we can do is try to strive to be better. And a lot of people are afraid to admit that they either got it wrong or just don't even know. A lot of people are afraid to say that they don't know. And how can we make progress if we're not admitting those things? We have to say that we don't know and we're not educated fully, and we need to start the conversations because that's where we learn.
Yeah, especially with I think the easiest thing is to listen. And then beyond that, like you said, to actively listen, because there's passive listening as well as active. But I guess with youth, they might not understand the significance of certain events that they might have never thought to have ever experienced, especially if they're traumatic. But just to bring it back with trauma, your course syllabus mentions intergenerational transmission and intersectional frameworks of trauma. So how often do you see those concepts applied to immigrant and refugee populations based off your knowledge as well as the students you've taught?
Sure. So another piece of trauma is intergenerational trauma. Intergenerational trauma is the idea that trauma can kind of be passed through from generation to generation. An example of that is, if you go back into the history of America around, slavery and those pieces, slavery, Jim Crow, hundreds of years of history. That has a lasting impact in families. And that impact can stay with families, again, for generations. Another example is also, within Jewish communities, things like the Holocaust. That impact can last for generations, where the fears, the distrust in systems, also the things that come out of it too, like financial injustices, systemic oppression, systemic racism. All of these pieces tie into each other, and all these pieces continue to connect to each other year after year. And what's important with intergenerational trauma is that we try to break the cycle of intergenerational trauma. But there's no way of doing that until we also, keep passing more policy and keep doing things that break what these systems are. So the way it kind of comes out within my work is, one, the students I work with individually, I have to, I have a few different roles. So one of my roles is doing clinical work. So that's where I'm sitting with the student one-on-one and more of a counseling capacity. So in that role, if I have students that come from different like marginalized backgrounds or anything like that, it's important for me, one, to make space to talk about that. How might that have impacted them? How might that be impacting their story? How might that be impacting their way of coping? And it's also important for me, like I said before, to listen. Me being me being a white counselor too, it's even more important for me to make a space that allows whoever I'm working with to talk about things like intergenerational trauma. Within my class, it's talked about because I put it in, I put it into the syllabus. But I felt that it's important for the students that I work with. The students I teach are often going into work at universities. So it's important for them to know, how does this come out at universities too? We see at universities kind of the impact of generational pieces as well. A lot of universities in the US were built by slaves. A lot of statues at different universities in the US still might not be appropriate. A lot of names of buildings often are controversial people or white supremacists or people that have owned slaves. So that has a lasting impact. It, a lot of times can tell people on the campuses that they're not welcomed. And when we preach the word inclusivity, we need to be mindful of, how do these pieces, how do these different symbols, how does the history take away from the inclusivity that you're trying to reach? Because it does have an impact on the people that are walking around.
Yeah, I feel like it's hard for some individuals maybe to understand the impact, especially if they haven't experienced that intergenerational trauma. Because if you have trauma in one, like in this lifetime, I guess like you're 80 years, like approximately, like that you passed with that. But if you have your grandparents on your shoulders as you're living like in present day, that's definitely like something I can't understand, like as well as like a lot of people. But like, with that being said, I guess like the consequences to like the mental like stress, trauma, PTSD, as you mentioned earlier, they might be neglected. So do you find that individuals with intergenerational trauma to have like several mental conditions, as well as resources that they can reach out to?
Based off of research, we know there's an impact. I think sometimes it plays out differently within, sessions where that's part of the conversation. It's hard to determine if that is the direct impact on the person. It depends on the person, right? Oftentimes people that come into our office have experienced like a direct sexual violence or domestic violence, but it still is intertwining with other experiences, because a lot of the ways we interact with our life is through those different identities, and that can come out through the cultures that we experience, again through the religions that we experience, and that can also add a lot of roadblocks or barriers too. So I guess to answer your question, yes, it has an impact. And then in terms of resources, again, that's going to really depend on where you are, what state you're in, what country you're in. I do have a list of some resources though that tie into whether it's like immigrant communities or communities of color. Do you want me to kind of just read them off right now, or would that be best? And then I can send you the links afterwards.
Yep, that sounds good.
Okay. So some resources that I made a list here for you all. So I have the Coalition for Immigrant and Mental Health. That's a coalition that's within the United States. They kind of provide, a few different things, but one of the main things that's featured on their website is a full list of therapists or organizations that can be kind of tailored towards immigrant communities or more inclusive or understanding of those communities. I have the organization Therapy for Latinx. They kind of do the same thing, but they have a list of counselors or agencies or things like that that are welcoming and understanding of issues that pertain to people within Latinx communities. I have the organization Inclusive Therapist, same concept. That one's a little bit more broad, but these are a bunch of therapists, and they had specifically on their website too, topic, a section for immigrant / refugee, just a whole list of therapists that know more about these issues. I have the National Asian American Pacific Islander Mental Health Association. So that comes out of the United States as well. Same concept there. And then the South Asian Mental Health Initiative and Network, same concept, where they include resources, specific people, as well as ways to reach out to them as well.
We also think that it is important to initiate clinical and professional support for all kinds of survivors available to your service at any time. To continue on, what are the ways that you help raise awareness of refugee and immigrant issues today in our modern society?
Yeah, so for myself specifically, what I'm trying to do is, one, educate myself more. I really have invested a lot of my time and space into working with survivor communities and issues around violence. And again, that pertains to refugees and immigrant communities as well. But for me, I need to know more. So one thing I did, now it's 2 years, which is crazy. 2 years ago, I went to a conference that talked a little bit more about these issues. And one really interesting discussion there was about access to technology, and how a lot of, especially immigrants who are undocumented, often don't want to use technology for, out of fear of being tracked and things like that. And that's important to know, because a lot of universities are trying to use tech more to remove barriers, and that's a good thing. It does help certain people, but if people aren't accessing technology, that doesn't remove the barrier for especially people that might be avoiding it. Another thing, I mean, I've been to, again, in the education process, just other workshops too, of trying to learn more. And I continue to learn more about the barriers. And that's kind of one of the unfortunate things that I want to see shift even within my office, which is, there still is a ton of barriers on why survivors who are refugees or survivors who are immigrants might not want to come to our office. Some of that can be fear that our office is going to make them report, which is not true, but there is that fear. We don't push anybody to report in our office because we do counseling. But a lot of people have that assumption. And then the other big piece that you all are handling is there's the language barriers too. That's a big barrier too in terms of mental health. A lot of therapists, a lot of counselors don't speak multiple languages, and still statistically, a lot of counselors and mental health professionals come from white backgrounds. And a lot of people want to talk to people within their communities because they feel that they're going to connect more or understand more, or they want to be able to do counseling in their own languages. So it's also important that we can figure out ways to have more representation across mental health agencies as well, and find ways to get more people to become counselors. And that's another long discussion there too, but those are just some of the pieces.
Thank you so much for bringing the issue of language barriers. And I just wanted to say that our main goal is to help them be able to just really talk to their neighbors and their neighboring stores wherever they go, in order to just help them have normal and casual discussions without feeling so stressed and fear that they're not going to be understood. So thank you so much for bringing that issue.
And just adding on, but what other topics that might not be taught in your class right now do you think society should emphasize or educate others on?
I mean, there's a lot of time. I think what people need to do is start listening to education from people from across more communities. And what I mean by that is, a lot of the history of like feminism and gender equality, we often heard from women, which is good, but also as a lot of stories from white women. And not that those stories should be invalidated in any way, but again, these experiences affect different communities differently. We need to make space for all voices. topic wise, like specific topic wise, I mean, I guess these are my own personal interests, but I am interested on the issues of like gun violence. You know, a lot of children, a lot of high schoolers are coming in with just exposure to trauma that's constantly shown on TV and through multiple mass shootings. And somebody doesn't have to be there to experience the trauma response. When we're exposed to all this trauma that's seen on social media, I mean, TikTok is another big space. Some people might internalize that as trauma, and then it's just when this trauma is not handled, it's coming into a lot of times college too. And college might be the first time maybe that they'll get to explore it a little bit more. And I guess that's another topic in itself, which is K through 12 education. I don't know if it's different in Canada, if it's K through 12. I know it's different in different places, but school before college. That's a topic in itself, because we need to talk about how a lot of this work is not happening early enough, right? Like children can start talking about some of these issues when they're young. And I think there's a fear of talking about it in high school or middle school or things like that. Sometimes it's like a lack of funding or a lack of people. But when we don't make these spaces, it normalizes the silence. And the silence shouldn't be normalized. We need to encourage these conversations earlier, because then we can actually try to prevent the outcomes of it, which is unaddressed mental health, violence behavior, or ineffective coping mechanism.
Thank you for your response, and thank you so much for consenting and participating in this our list of questions in the interview. And I just want to thank you personally for really broadening my perspective as well as other interviewers, because I thought, you know, I'm a high schooler, I might not have a traumatic experience, then I'm out of conversation. That's what I ashamedly thought. But thank you so much for letting us know that we also have to engage in the conversation and engage in the story and be supportive and empower them.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for creating this space, but not only this space, but thank you all for doing the work that you all are doing. And the fact that you all are doing this work as young people, high schoolers, is amazing, right? It shows that one, high schoolers can take on this work. And if you all are doing this work now, I'm confident, I'm excited to see what you all are going to be doing in the future, because language barriers is a huge thing, and the fact that you were able to put all this together again is amazing.